Hi all. My name is Ibrahim Jouhari. I will give you today's seminar on the topic of the US disengagement from the Middle East. Introductions. As I said, my name is Ibrahim Jouhari. I am from Lebanon, the small, democratic, and currently one of the few stable countries in a burning region. You can see the civil war in Syria, although it's calming down, but you also have Yemen, you have problems in Iraq, you have big problems in Libya. So the Middle East is currently a rather a big region in upheaval, if we could say so. I work as a senior analyst in the International Affairs Unit of Lebanon Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri. I also work as a political science and history of Lebanon instructor at the American University for Science and Technology in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. And I was recently part of the study of the UN Institute program about security policy making in the United States. This program is funded by the State Department, and we were 18 scholars from all over the world, and it is there where I met your professor. Next. I have an MA in political studies from the American University of Beirut, and I have a BA in journalism from the Lebanese American University. You can see I've posted a beautiful picture of the campus of the American University of Beirut. It's one of the leading universities in Lebanon and the region, and I highly encourage you to seek possibly an exchange program or come take a few courses about the region, courses on Arabic. If you need any help with that, I will put my email and my phone number, so don't hesitate to contact me for that or anything else. The rationale. Why I chose this topic. As I said, the seminar will tackle the issue of the US disengagement from the Middle East, and we will first test the hypothesis and try to establish its veracity. Is the US really disengaging from the Middle East? Then in the second part we will move to ascertain the reasons of this disengagement, and in the last part of this seminar we will try to identify which countries could fill the void of the US disengagement. Why this topic? So, why this topic? Mainly because the Middle East is a strategic and a very important region of the world. The Middle East has at least 56% of the proven oil reserves, as you can see in the graph, and most international maritime and land trade routes passes through the Middle East, and there is at least 3 or 4 choke points into which most of the trade of oil and other passes through. I can name, for example, the Suez Canal, the Horn of Africa, the Hormuz Strait. So it's a very strategic place. Additionally, the 3 big religion of the world have their holy shrines. There is, if you want, the main religious cities are in this part of the world, which make many people have more than political or strategic attachment. They have a very religion irrational attachment to the region and to the events of this region. For example, you have Mecca and Medina for Islam, you have Jerusalem for Christianity and for Judaism. Finally, the Middle East has been the source of extremist religious terrorism that has been plaguing the world. I can name you ISIS, Al-Qaeda, with the 9/11 events, the 19 hijacker all came from the Middle East. ISIS was formed, the grew, and was operating in this region. So, the framework of this study: is the US really disengaging? We have 3 parts: political will, number of soldiers and bases, and the military budget. The reason of this disengagement, why the US is disengaging: you have oil, fatigue and no goals, popular and endemic isolationism, and third and finally, filling the void. Who will fill the void if the US is really disengaging? We have Russia, China, and several other local powers. So, the main question: is the US really disengaging from this very strategic and important region of the world? Political will. For the past almost decades and even more, the US have been heavily engaged in the region. But recently, more and more, we started having a political will, politicians in the US that have been under pressure and expressing their views that they need to disengage. You have the very famous saying, bring the troops back home. Both Trump and even Obama were calling for an end of the endless war with no definite end goal set. For example, Afghanistan, we're talking the US have been involved in Afghanistan for more than 15 years. What is their goal? Why are they there? They went there just after 9/11. They pushed Taliban. They established another government, but there is no end in sight. Every time the number of US troops diminishes, the more and more problems happen, and all what they have accomplished is lost, and they lose terrain and political power. So they can leave and they have to stay, but they have no idea why they are there. They have no strategic goal set. Additionally, Trump is clearly an isolationist. He focuses more on the internal rather than the international arena, with his famous America First, which will be tackled soon in the next part. It's important here, as we are speaking about strategic issues and important overreaching goals, that what Field Marshal Montgomery from the UK Field Marshal from World War II, he said that strategy is the art of distributing and applying military means, such as armed forces and supplies, to fulfill the ends of policy. So any military campaign should have an end goal. So we ask again, what is the end goal of US engagement in Afghanistan, in Iraq? Is it to finish with Al-Qaeda? They did. Is it to finish with ISIS? They did. So why are they still in Iraq? Is it to support the government? Till when? Especially that the government in Iraq now is closer to Iran. So there are major questions and there is no answers. If you read the strategic overview of the US in the region, it's a bit vague about the strategic and goals of the US engagement in this region. Additionally, Sun Tzu, the great Chinese military philosopher, said, "Do not move unless there are definite advantages to be gained. There has never been a protracted war that has brought benefit to the state." So I'll say it again, the US has been in Afghanistan and in Iraq for more than a decade and a half with no end in sight. What are the benefits? Why are they there? And then we now speak about a different issue that the politicians in the US have felt that what I'm talking about. There is no end in sight, there is no tangible benefits for their presence and engagement in the Middle East, so they started thinking of changing their focus from the Middle East towards Asia. Asia, where you have China, the rising economic, political, and military power. So, one of the hallmarks of US foreign policy under President Obama has been the attempt to reorient the direction of the State Department toward a rising Asia and away from the Middle East. Williams, 2016. Additionally, in late 2011, the Obama administration with great fanfare announced its intention to pivot, to rebalance to Asia as a foreign policy and national security priority. Why? Because as I said, the rising economic and political and military power of China. The administration sensibly sought to refocus America's strategic priorities to reflect the growing importance of Asia in global affairs, and trying to stop or at least contain China, make sure that its growing economic and military powers are not left unchecked, and with no direct benefit from staying in the Middle East. The administration of Obama, and now of course of Trump, they started thinking that it would be better for the US to focus on Asia, on China, on Korea, strengthening ties with Southeast Asia, with India, with Japan, Central Asia, with Kazakhstan, making sure that all these countries are closer to them than they are closer to China. Sorry. Next, we will speak about one of the main reasons why the US was in the Middle East was because of the Cold War. America's regional posture in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf was firmly rooted in the legacy of the US rivalry when the region was a fighting ground. The two big USSR and US couldn't fight against each other because of the nuclear deterrent, so they had to find other places, other countries to fight their proxy wars. And this is how the Middle East became a region where a strategic region where both focused a lot on it and trying to make sure they control it by engaging, spending their money, sending troops, propping up allies, fighting proxy wars. However, when the Berlin Wall came tumbling down in 1989 and America won the Cold War, this focus of the US stayed, and for no, if you want, big strategic reasons, except for a few that we will discuss later on. And this is how the origin, if you like, of the US engagement in this region. At long last, I think that the US politicians have came out of this Cold Era mindset about the importance of the Middle East, and they are now focusing away, maybe pivoting to China and to other places. Our second subsection in part 1, where we are trying to identify and find out if the US is really disengaging, is a very quantifiable, data-oriented study. Troop numbers. If the US is disengaging from the East, then their number of troops in this region should also be going down. And as you can see in this graph, there is a direct and clear fall, diminishing of the number of US troops in the region. Not only the troops in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the other few countries where the US have a presence, but also all over the world. This is the other part, the isolationism of Trump. But regardless, this graph shows you clearly that the number of troops, of US troops in the Middle East, is clearly diminishing, which is an indication, a practical indication that the US is indeed disengaging from the region. The political will that we spoke about in the previous subsection is being translated on the ground. The troops number in the 2008, 2009, 2010, and even 2011 was between 160,000 to almost 200,000 US troops between Afghanistan and Iraq. Now they have fallen up to less than 20,000 in 2015, and lately in 2018 Donald Trump even wanted to withdraw the few thousand of US troops in Syria that are guarding the border between Syria and Iraq after the fight against ISIS. He also wanted to withdraw them. So this trend is still ongoing. Next, you can see that the number of troops, of US troops deployed outside, overseas, is overall diminishing, and diminishing in a great number. You can see that with this more historical graph from the Pew Research Center. As you can see, this great spike is because of the Vietnam War, and then you can see how it slowly diminished. You have in the 90s because of the 93 war, Gulf War against Iraq, and there was a surge on. Yes, as I was saying, you can see here it was for the 1993 first Gulf War, and then you had the other surge in Iraq, and then it has been on a significant downtrend. Here you can see in numbers, we were talking of 2 million, and it has fallen to 1.4, and it has been kept on falling. This is the overall active duty forces in the US Army, inside and outside. Inside the US and overseas, it includes all active duty: Army, Air Force, Marines. So this is a isolationist trend that we will discuss a bit later. So again, this is reinforcing our hypothesis that the US is disengaging from the Middle East, and overall the US is withdrawing its troops from overseas, again into a more isolationist trend. Next, we can see the different number of troops of the US all over the place. This is of 2016. In the Americas, 2,600. In Europe, with the presence of a large contingent in Germany. You have the Middle East, which has fallen from number 1 region with troop deployment in 2010 with more than 200,000. Now it has fallen to the number 3 with only 25,000. The most troops in Asia are in South Korea and in the bases in Japan. Next, you can see the number of US military personnel deployment by country. As you can see, it has changed a lot. You have around 35% that are present in the US proper. We are talking now about the global military expenditure. You can see that there are the US spends 35% of the global budget on military. The next one is Russia with 4, China with around 13, Saudi Arabia, India, and France around 3%, Saudi Arabia around 5, Great Britain also at 3. The military personnel, that was what I was referring to. There is at least now 2,100,000, and they are actively deployed around 1.3 million. And you can see domestically 85% and foreignly around 15%. These are US Army personnel. Overseas deployment, as you can see, mainly we have a large contingent in Europe with Germany and several other places. You have in South Korea and Japan a lot of soldiers, and much diminished recently in the Middle East. I would like to remind you of the numbers we recently discussed, that at the height of their deployment in 2010 and 2003, you had around 200,000 US troops in this region. So it was at a much higher percentage. It was the number one region with US deployment. Now it has fallen to number 3, and it is falling. It's keep on falling. Again, we are reinforcing our first hypothesis. The US is truly disengaging from the Middle East. We move on to the budget. As you can see, with the overall diminishing of troops and diminishing of overseas deployed US troops personnel, also the US overall defense budget has been falling from a height of $700 billion into around $600 billion. Although the last years you had Trump, who is hawkish on defense, and he has been increasing the budget, but even with Trump, the budget is still, in a trend-wise, lower than it has been at the height of US engagement and deployment on the Middle East, again reinforcing our hypothesis. Despite all what I just said, the US currently is spending more on defense and on military budget than the other 7 countries combined. Yani you have China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, France, United Kingdom, and Japan. All the next countries in the list, they all spend less than the US spend on its own. So despite that, what we just said, the diminishing numbers, we should not make the mistake of thinking that the US is no longer we could say the superpower, military and economy. No. We are discussing trends, but overall it is still the number one economic force, it is still the number one military force, and it's still able to deploy, project its power all over the world. We are just talking trend, and we are specifically talking about the US trend of disengaging from the Middle East. It's an important point to keep in mind. This is an interesting graph from Statista website. If you have any research about trends and data, it's a very important website for visualizing data and trends over the years. As you can see, whenever there is a big crisis, the US Department of Defense budget grows, and then in times of peace or less tension, it goes down. You can see the different peaks. You have the Vietnam War, you have the Cold, and when it ended, the Cold War when it ended, it went down. You have 9/11 and a very steep spike and increase in spending, and then the surge in Iraq to end the Iraq crisis, and then you have another steep decrease in the budget. So we are now wrapping up section 1. It is important to restate the main findings. I think we have established with high certainty that the US is indeed disengaging from the Middle East. We noted and found out that the last 2 US presidents, we are talking about Trump and we are talking about Obama, have both expressed the political will to move away from the Middle East, focusing on other areas, for example Asia, or focusing internally like Trump is projecting to do. This political will has translated in a decreasing number of troops and bases in the region, and it was also translated into a shrinking budget. So now we are going to move to discover the reasons behind this US disengagement from the Middle East. Unfortunately, I'm not able to interact directly with you for technical reasons. However, I will be around for any Q&A. If we are able to make a Skype connection after the end of my seminar, I would gladly answer your question directly and live via Skype call. If we are not, I would also encourage you to write any of your questions while you are listening to my seminar, and your professor hopefully will be able to send them to me, and I will also be able to answer them either by email or even by an additional voice answers that I will send directly after the session. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions and write them down. Now on to section 2. Why is the US disengaging from the Middle East? The reasons: 1. Oil. 2nd, fatigue and no goals. 3rd is a popular and endemic isolationism in the US psychological makeup. Oil. After the Cold War and during the Cold War and even after it, one of the main goals and strategic imperatives of the US, of why it was so focused on the Middle East, was to ensure a steady stream of oil to the US from the Middle East. And this was one of the main focus of the US. However, in the second decade of the 2000s, in around 2012-13, new technology allowed the US to regain its number one spot as an oil producing country, going above Russia and Saudi Arabia, as you can see in this graph. What happened? The US has invented a new method called shale oil fracking, oil producing. It's a complicated way of pumping in special liquids in old oil producing facilities, wells, and getting more and more oil. This has changed the whole oil industry in Texas and other places in the US, and allowed many old wells to get back in business, and even the discovery of new oil fields that previously the technology did not allow anyone to pump oil from them. With the new technology, they are now able to extract more and more oil. This revolution is not a short term, it's a medium term, and the oil production of the US is only projected to increase. And indeed, for the first time in decades, the US produced more oil than it consumed. And this is very important. Why? Because it means that the US is self-reliant on oil. It no longer needs to import, although it still does for many reasons, mainly price, and for other reasons that are too specific for this seminar. But still, this is an important milestone. The US no longer need to import oil in big quantities. The translation of that is what was a strategic imperative, maintaining its oil supply, has become another important issue among many other. For example, the US has an important issue of importing uranium, aluminium, rare earth material for its technology, but it's not a strategic life or death point. So oil now has fallen into the important part or important materials that the US need to pay attention to, but it's no longer a vital one because the US is now self-reliant on oil. So what was of strategic importance, oil, and as we already said that the Middle East has at least 56% of oil reserve, has now fallen down from the strategic level, and the US can afford to focus on other points, on other more important strategic issues like the rising might of China with its great industry and economy and growing military might. It may be also time to focus on Russia and its new expansion. So, again, this oil revolution in the US has diminished the importance of the Middle East tremendously. Next, when we discussed the importance of the Middle East, you would notice that one of the importance was the trade routes. In ancient times, and even not long ago, the Middle East was at the middle of most trade routes. As you can see, most trade routes come through here, and through land it comes through here. However, now, as you can see, more and more trades is between the US and Europe, and the US and China and Asia, Japan. This region has starting to fall of the strategic importance in trade. It's still important. You can still see how much trade goes through here, through the Suez Canal, and then down, especially with oil. It's very important for oil, but again, we just discussed that oil is from the Middle East, oil is no longer that important. It's becoming less and less so. Also trade, the importance of the Middle East as a trade hub, as a trade importance, has fallen by the wayside. So, for the US, the Middle East strategic importance as a trade and commerce transit hub has also diminished, especially with China rising importance as a trade partner to the US. Most commerce is flowing through the Pacific or the Atlantic to Europe and to China. Next point, next subsection, fatigues and no-goals. So we spoke about it, but it's important to restate it. The US has been in Afghanistan and Iraq since the early 2000s, in Afghanistan since 2001, in Iraq 2003, with no end in sight. What were the goals achieved? The US is now sitting down on the table with Al-Qaeda. They are involved in peace talks with Al-Qaeda. Again, Iraq is effectively controlled by Iran. The cost of both has been staggering. According to the Congressional Budget Office report published in October 2007, the US war in Iraq and Afghanistan could cost taxpayers a total of $2.4 trillion by 2017. Trillion is 1,000 billion. Imagine. Especially when you add the huge interest rates, because most of this money was borrowed. In 2019, the US national debt stand at almost 22 trillions, according to the US Treasury Department. So imagine the US involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East in general has caused the US almost 11% of its total national debt. And for what? What were the goals? What were the accomplishments? Additionally, there's an important shaping factor surrounding the pivot to Asia that we just spoke about, is the widespread perception of a general decline of American power around the world. Indeed, you have this growing giant called China that is now economically and militarily in the next few years on the heels of the US. The US has spent so much treasure on the Middle East, but it has let this big giant do as it pleases. So it's time for the US to focus on China. Indeed, the United States is seen as entering a period of global retrenchment. Retrenchment is another word for isolationism when it goes back into a base to reassess its role in the world and think. Because after 14 years and counting of unsuccessful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US, with empty coffers at home, broken alliances abroad, and a dysfunctional domestic political environment, has all sapped the country will and energy. And for the American people, politician and elite, it is time to go back home, entrench itself, think, and rediscover its place in the world. Third, throughout the US history, and even from its genesis, from its beginning, the US has always been isolationist. It's not new. It's part of its US political culture. It's even part of the US popular, historic, and public culture, not only political. Since the earliest days, the US, the country, have been. There was two different directions that are trying to push the US into these two different paths, each belonging to an opposite political theory. Isolationism versus internationalism, retreating inside the American continent versus opening up to the world, unilateralism versus multilateralism, closing its border or opening its border and becoming the American dream, the land of being open and welcoming to all refugees from all over the world. This divide has not been resolved yet, and with Trump, it has been brought to the forefront of US policymaking. And all these subjects that have been discussed at length throughout the history of the US are now back on the table. What is the US going to do? What is its outlook? What is its strategic overview of the next few years? Does it want to have big alliances, a close relationship with the Western European countries in order for opening up of trade and of alliances, or it is going into the isolationism of the, if you want, previous decades, and especially between the two world wars? President Trump, America First doctrine, advocate nationalist, anti-interventionist positions. He advocates putting U.S. interests first and which will make everyone safer and more prosperous. This is the basic, if you want, strategic ideas and outlook of Donald Trump. He wants to put America first. He no longer care about NATO. He no longer care about projecting the US power all over the world to protect its allies like Japan, like South Korea, against China and North Korea, or supporting its Western allies and protecting them against Russia. Donald Trump wants to focus on America, which is, on the surface, is not a wrong thing for the President of America to say, but it's a very short-sighted and maybe naive strategy, because America's strength is not only focusing on itself. America's strength is its global network, its global allies, it's the ability to project its power. And without, in my opinion, without multilateralism, without having allies, without having all this strategic overture over the world, America will not only lose this power, it will also lose economic power on the longer term. People, other countries, other forces will look for another power, and they will create another power to play the role of the US. So the US will either play its role as what much maligned police officer of the world, or it will lose its place and someone else would take that role. In the age of Donald Trump, Americans are again divided over whether multilateral cooperation is consistent with national sovereignty and national interest. His America First agenda resurrects the slogan of interwar isolationists, who believe that the nation could and should insulate itself from global troubles and focus internally to become stronger and to become more powerful. Indeed, as I told you, this goes back to the early days of the US. The famous quote from John Adams, who said, "America goes not abroad in search for monster to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all." Even George Washington said, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relation to have as little political connection as possible." Focus on this phrase, as little political connection as possible. Why? By not interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Again, this echoes what part of what Donald Trump is saying, that America has always been focused on internal issues and would prefer not to be involved in alliances and foreign intervention. Even as a popular opinion, the American people have a great disregard and disagreement with going into international adventures and such as that. For example, agree or disagree, we shouldn't think so much in international terms, but concentrate more on our own national problems and building up our strengths and prosperity here at home in the US. Throughout the years from 64 up to 2006, a large majority of the Americans prefer to focus on internal issues. Again, in another research by the Pew Research Center, another very good center for data and that would help you a lot in your research. The majority says the US should mind its own business internationally and stay away from any involvement. The question was, US should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. As you can see, from 64 up to 2013, you had a rather plurality, and this has become a majority in 2013, with 52% of the Americans who say that the US should mind its own business internationally. Once more, as we finished here our second section, I would really encourage you to not hesitate to ask any question about what we just discussed. The easiest way is to write them down, give them to your professor, and he will communicate them to me, and I will try to answer hopefully during this session, or if not, then I will send you by email my answers. This is you can see my email, and my contacts are with your professor. Hopefully we can have a direct Skype call after I finish the explanation and this seminar. So next we will move to the third part of the presentation. I hope in the second part I will do a small wrap up. I hope you understood that the reasons of US disengagement are threefold. One, we have the strategic importance of the Middle East was linked directly to oil, and as I have demonstrated, oil has been importance has been getting a bit lower because the US is, for the first time in decades, have been producing more than it is using of oil, and it is exporting more than it is importing. That's one. Second, now the US is the number one oil producing due to its shale oil revolution. That's one. Second is the US has been mired in decades-long war with no tangible benefits in the Middle East that has cost almost $2 trillion, and this caused many of the Americans to move into a more isolationist mindset. And a third, we talk about how this idea of that America should care only about itself and not spend its money and resources and blood on the world to be the policeman of the world, that it's an endemic, it's an idea that goes back to the first beginning of the US as a great country with John Adams and George Washington. Onward to the third and final part of this seminar. So, nature, political science, and especially international relation abhors a void of any kind. Anytime there is a void, somebody must fill it. And as we established, and we explained the reason, with the US disengaging from the Middle East, the contenders are waiting in turn to fill this void. So we will start with the rising power of China and the returning power of Russia, and we will speak a bit about the different local players and the further players. Russia involvement in the Middle East goes a long time ago with the Ottoman Empire and the fight and all that. But if we are talking about modern times, US after the fall of the USSR, the Russia has withdrawn into its core lands and has become less involved internationally. However, with Putin autocratic growth and focus, he has returned to a more expansionist view of political affairs and international relations. And for him, the key moment was in 2013 when President Obama failed to retaliate for the Syrian regime chemical attack and the famous red line he drew on the sand when he said that any chemical attack will be the US will respond harshly against the Syrian regime of Assad, who was dealing with a revolution of his people. So in 2013 a chemical attack happened on the rebels held areas in Syria by the Syrian regime of Assad. Obama threatened to attack, and there was preparation for that. However, the attack did not come for many reasons, and from that moment it was as if the US has taken a conscious and practical move of not interfering anymore, of disengaging, and this opened the door wide for Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war, which Russia used as a doorway to get even more involved in the Middle East, filling the void that we have just talked about, the void that was left by American disengagement from the Middle East. So the Russian involvement, first by airplanes and then by bringing boots on the ground and then by taking two big bases, military bases, one aerial and the other one maritime in Syria. This marked an important step in Russia's strategic move, getting boots on the ground, establishing military bases in the Middle East for the first time since the Afghanistan war in the 1980s, for the first time since the fall of the USSR. And, which is even more important, this move into the Middle East, Russia has accomplished one of its oldest and most vital strategic imperative of controlling a warm water port. You need to remember that Russia has always faced the dilemma of not having warm waters war, because it is on the northern side, most of the seashore is frozen during winter, and the Black Sea is limited by the abilities and by the control of at that point by the Ottoman Empire, and at later point by the Turkish, who were part of NATO. So Russia was always focused on having a warm sea outlet for its boat, and it finally got this by having not one but two big ports on the Mediterranean in Latakia and Tartus. This is a very important strategic development for Russia, and you can see the different bases it has now. The numbers of Russian troops in Syria is open to interpretation, but we can say it is in the thousands. They have lost at least 100 or 200, but they are there and they are expanding their presence in the Middle East by having these bases in Syria. Additionally, the role of Russia in the Middle East is set to grow with further disengagement of the US. Russia is actively trying to sign military agreements with several countries in the Middle East other than Syria, like Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and others. And Russia is also trying to establish further military bases in the Middle East. It's also trying to sign additional business and military deals, not only military agreements. And it is trying to play the role of power broker between all the different players in the Middle East. That a role, and this is important, that the US used to play in the past. And you can see in the graph, Russia is now the main power broker. It has direct relation with Iran, relation with Turkey, with Assad regime, with Sisi in Egypt, and with Netanyahu. And whenever two or many of them are fighting, they go back to Russia, which try to keep on a semblance of balance. For example, Israel is almost daily or weekly bombing Iranian forces or Iranian proxy in Syria, and this is happening with acknowledgement and agreement of Russia. Same when Egypt and Turkey got into a big fight, it was Russia who tried to mediate between them. And again, it is Russia that is keeping Iran from fighting Israel. A role, I would like to remind you, that was played by the US before its disengagement. So Russia is now filling a big part of this void that was left by the US. Moreover, if we take an important researcher in this area, Mr. Campbell, in one of his articles, all the references you can find them at the end of this, and I can send the full list via email if anybody is interested. He said, indeed, Russia is rapidly expanding its footprint in the Middle East as it seeks to assert itself as a dominant player in the region. Today, it has several military bases in Syria. It has signed lucrative business and military deals with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Iran. If you can see, these countries are at odds with each other. Iran and Saudi Arabia hate each other. Similarly for Kuwait and United Arab Emirates. So now Russia is dealing with all of them, and it in return to the quote, it has bought shares in oil and gas in the Mediterranean companies and new exploration. And as the only actor that has a relation with almost everyone, it is proving to be the go-to mediator for conflict across the region. Again, a role that was played for decades by the US. It is now played by Russia. The future of Russia in the Middle East. First, you can see that the Russian military expenditure has been growing steadily for the past decades. It is now around $75 billion. It was a decade ago, it was less than 30 or 40. There is abundant evidence that Moscow is steadily gaining traction across the entire Middle East thanks to its multi-dimensional strategy. Moscow has seized an ascending position in the Middle East that goes far beyond Syria. That position enables it to be the major actor in the region for years to come. We're talking about the future now. Additionally, Russia is making a concerted effort to reclaim its role as the arms supplier of choice for Arab government. So it's not only military, it's not only strategic, it's also business wise. Now we move into our last part, and with China. China usually, historically, has been absent from the Middle East, limiting itself to business and oil deals, with no involvement or strategic imperative. However, lately, with the US disengagement, again with the void, people like to fill voids, especially on the international relations arena and strategically. So, with the US disengagement, it has started playing a more important role. This increased activity has been formulated in China's new Belt and Road Initiative. I will just give you a brief overview. In the last few years, China has came up with a very ambitious and enormous initiative called the Belt and Roads. It's a $1 trillion mega project, a global development strategy adopted by the Chinese government involving infrastructure development and investment in 71 countries that account for half of the world population and a quarter of global GDP. The main idea is for China to build roads, that's the roads part, from China into Western Europe for increasing trade, increasing exchanges, increasing commerce, and for building up big ports and infrastructure project for the Belt's maritime Silk Roads that also goes from China up to Western Europe. As you can see in this plan, the Middle East is at the heart of this plan, and this is why China has been more and more involved, spending money, building bases, buying ports in the Middle East and a bit farther away. Why? Because it wants to ensure that this project will be brought to finish and will be beneficial for it. For all these part of the project go through the Middle East, and this is why China is now more and more involved economically, but also militarily and politically. As in my work in the Prime Minister's office in Lebanon, we have been seeing a resurgent and increased involvement of Chinese delegation, business delegation, political delegation that comes to Lebanon, that wants to create projects, that want to start projects, that want to invest. For example, they start a big investment in our northern city of Tripoli, building railroad tracks that links this big port to Syria, and even putting investment in the port, maybe to have a bigger impact in the region. With Russia taking the Syrian ports, the Chinese maybe are thinking of having a bigger impact here. Why? Because it is a key, the Middle East plays a key part of their new role and new project of the Belt and Roads. Additionally, the Chinese have been growing their military, and their military budget have been steadily increasing throughout the years. You can see the trend. So the Chinese and the Russian military budget have been increasing, meanwhile the US have been diminishing. You can see it's a clear trend. Thank you for attention. I will just, before I finish, I will just spend a few words on, although we spoke about the two main powers, there is a few smaller powers such as Turkey and all that. I will try to speak about them a bit. 1 second. Yes, sorry for this slight mishap. So, other than the big powers, you have several smaller powers in the region that have been trying to take advantage and filling the void that was left by the US. For example, you have Iran, Turkey, KSA, and even Israel. However, they are each faced by a set of impediments. For example, Iran has a Shiite Islam majority, Shiite Muslim majority, while the rest of the Middle East is a Sunni Islam. They are like Catholics and Orthodox Catholics and Protestant, but in Islam, the different branches of Islam. So the problem of Iran is trying to play a bigger role, but however they are faced with backlash that the rest of the Middle Eastern countries do not share the same religious beliefs, and this is impeding its growth. Although Iran has been steadily growing in importance and it is now heavily involved in Iraq, it has now have a big presence in Yemen. It's also very influential in Syria, where it helped the Assad regime fight the different rebels, and it's also present in Lebanon in Hezbollah. So although Iran has this impediment, but since the removal of Saddam Hussein, which played a role of balancing, it has been playing a much important and bigger role in the region, and they are trying to expand this role. They are facing some impediments, as I said, and lately the US have been keen to limit and contain its growth and its emergent power by sanctions, by propping up their allies and the powers that have been historically against Iran, like Saudi Arabia. And it seems that the US have been able to contain somehow Iran, but the next few months will give us more about that. In the same vein, the Saudi Arabia has been trying to play the full part of the role that was played by the US by launching their own involvement in Yemen against Turkey to sell different variables and successes. Again, they are faced by the same impediment of Iran. Part of the Middle East is Shiites, part is Saudi Arabia are Sunnis, so they cannot expand much. With the lower price of oil, they have less monetary funds and power to use them to extend their powers. However, they are trying also to expand. You also have Turkey, which is trying that. Again, they are facing some troubles, especially that they are at times at odds with Russia, which is having a bigger role to play in the Middle East, and at other times they have problems with America, and so especially Saudi Arabia. So as you can see, we will end with the last smaller one, Israel and Qatar. Israel, although have much one of the best military in the region, but again they are too few. There are 6 million in a region of 300 million, so their impact is limited to defense. Meanwhile, Qatar are also a small country, but they have lots and lots of money, so they are each trying to play a role in this big void left by the US to varying degrees. As you can see, now we're in the final part and the conclusion. We have established that the US is disengaging from the Middle East, that we spoke about, we proved how that was happening. We spoke about the reasons: oil, isolationism, and endemic feeling of not wanting to be involved in big wars. And we spoke about the countries. It's very hard for countries inside the Middle East to play the role that the US is playing, so they are each taking a niche, taking a part of the pie left by the US in the region, trying to extend their influence. But the main, if you want, the main two powers that have inherited lots of the void left by the US are, in the first place, much more important is Russia, which is now practically controls a lot what is happening in Syria, and it has growing relations with many other countries that have been historically close to the US, like Turkey and like Egypt. China is a newcomer. It's still new, but with its economic might, it's making inroads and having more and more control. of the region and filling the void left by the US. Finally, I thank you for your attention. I hope this has been very interesting for you, and it had taught you important things about our region that has been unfortunately plagued with wars and with upheaval. And as I said, I really enjoyed giving you this seminar. Please do not hesitate to contact me. I will try to be available for a Skype call for a direct and live Q&A. Hopefully we can set it up. Otherwise, I hope you have sent me emails throughout this listening to this, and I will try to answer them now, and if not, I will make sure to send you each response to your email. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure giving you this seminar. Thank you.